Take a person, take a story, take you on a journey. It's your take.
On today's Your Take, I'm joined by a fellow Bristolian who lives and breathes music. My guest spent some of his childhood living in South America. He went to Oxford and later Bristol University to read English language and literature. He eventually settled in Bristol and began his musical journey. This started as a drummer in several punk bands in the late 1970s, before establishing a record magazine called the Bristol Recorder with a group of like-minded friends. It was here he met British musician Peter Gabriel, and by 1981, devised and organised the first WOMAD Festival the following year. Over the course of 26 years, he worked as the festival and artistic director. He co-founded Real World Records in 1987, and through to 2008, programmed, organised and produced more than 145 WOMAD festivals in 24 countries. In 2008, he received the CBE for his life services to music and charity. He would also go on to write the book, My Festival Romance, which documents his time as WOMAD Festival organiser and curator. Today, I talked to Thomas Brooman. We discussed Thomas's early life, his lifelong passion for music, meeting Peter Gabriel and his WOMAD journey, and making people aware of different musical artists and cultures. A very warm welcome. Thank you kindly for joining us today on Your Take.
Thank you.
I'm looking forward to talking about music, but I think more importantly, not the fact that you've just been a musician, but the many festivals you've organised and the many artists and musicians from different cultures that you've introduced us to over many, many years with your services to WOMAD. But I think to start with, Thomas, we'll turn the clock back to 1954, and you were born in Bristol a long, long time ago, but I wanted to ask you, what are your memories of the late 1950s and then the 1960s? And then I wanted to ask who your parents were, what they did for a living, and do you have siblings?
Okay, well, my memories of early childhood are very clear and kind of quite fond, really. We lived in a suburb called Clifton, which was in a university flat, because my dad was a university teacher, first a lecturer and then a professor of economics. And my mum was a homemaker, as they say, and very devoted to the family. And I remember Clifton was a very, very different kettle of fish then. Well, not a kettle of fish, that's a bad analogy, but a very different environment. And it was like a little village, really. I mean, not full of boutiques and fashion shops as it is now, but, you know, there was a butcher and a delicatessen, and the co-op supermarket was the ones, and Woolworths. And so lots of local and locally owned and run shops. And what was that? The second question then, in the 60s, though, everything did change. And I think because I was taken away for a year to Buenos Aires in Argentina. So that's in part the answer to your question, which we went to as a family because my dad was offered a very large amount of money to go and consult economically on Argentina's inflation. And so after a lot of family discussion, and it was a family decision, we decided to go. And I have very vivid memories of that, which I'll go on to in a little second. But it very much changed my life that year abroad. Does that answer anything that you asked?
Yeah, it does. And I kind of clearly want to come back to your time spent in South America, but I want to kind of pick up on the academia side, because you come from this academic background, and I kind of want to move on to your schooling, because you were schooled at Bristol Grammar School.
Yeah.
what are your memories from your time there, and which subjects did you excel in? And at that stage, did you have any sort of early career aspirations?
Well, I was very good at English and quite good at history, but basically I enjoyed doing what I was good at. I wanted the encouragement, which I suppose was the culture the school bred in all the pupils, and the school itself was a mixture of great discipline and great riot on the part of the pupils. And so we were very fond of acting up, as you might call it, but also kind of severely under the thumb of all the teachers who taught us. But there was some very good teaching and there was some pretty bad teaching too. But I still remember the good teachers, especially the English ones, who were just encouraging and supportive. And about the thing of the academic background, my dad had worked himself out or studied himself out of poverty. He came from Bradford in Yorkshire, and he went to Bradford Grammar School on a scholarship, so with no money, but sent to school, and then he had earned a scholarship to Oxford University after that. And so the horizons that my parents and my family helped to set were simply academic. It was just do well, because education is the way out of, the way up, as it were. But no, I didn't have any focused ambitions at that point. I was never taught a minute of music. I couldn't, but I did express the wish to. I asked to be the timpani player in the school orchestra when I was in the junior school, but they said, no, there's a queue, the position is filled. And so that was an end to that. Yes. And the other thing I remember very clearly about the acting up side of Bristol Grammar School was there was a lot of bullying. And there was like a particular set of boys in our class who were about 6 or 7, and they were so picked upon, it was just cruel. And as long as you kind of ran with the domineering crowd, you could avoid actually the bullying, but you could avoid the being bullied too. And so I'm kind of pretty ashamed to say that's who I was, neither bullying nor bullied.
I'm intrigued to talk about your time in Buenos Aires in Argentina for kind of 2 reasons. First, because it slightly resonates with kind of my family background, because my dad was out there during the sort of mid to late 1950s. But that aside, I also think it's going to tie in nicely when we find out later about all the places that you've traveled as part of your work.
Right.
I wanted to ask, at what age did the family emigrate to South America? You've already explained kind of the reasons. And can you tell us about your school in there, and were you able to speak Spanish fluently?
Well, we went there in 1963 over the summer holidays on a Royal Mail ship called HMS Arlanza, which was an absolute pleasure. I'm sure in terms of the pleasure cruising these days, it would have seemed kind of barbaric in its standards, but we loved it as children, And so we stopped in various ports on the way, and in Rio in Brazil, that was a very memorable stop, and Montevideo in Uruguay, and then our destination to Argentina. And we went there in 1963, which was absolutely the year of the Beatles arriving, as it were, in Britain, sweeping the country with their wonderful music. And it was really them that my love for music got, just defined and cemented. And so I was taken away from that environment and had to look on from this horrible thousands of mile distance as their fame grew and the passion grew. There was even an American Beatles that visited Argentina. They just landed. They landed in the aeroplane to the usual sort of adoring, screaming fans, and then took off again. And that was it. Never played a note. I don't think they could play a note, but they had the haircuts and they had the arrival by aeroplane. So it was a very strange time, really. I didn't learn to speak Spanish because I was sent to a very kind of orthodox English model public school where the Argentinian boys hated every foreigner. They hated us. So I had friends who were American and Dutch and German, and we were like isolated as a group and just tried to sort of keep out of the way of the bullying. But you couldn't really, because they made a pleasure out of it as their main sport, really. And because they'd started their education at the age of 4, I think, a year before us, they were older boys I was in the class with. And so I was 9 and they were all 10. And they were horrid, horrid people. And that's what really changed my life entirely. And so, yes, I didn't learn any Spanish because they learned Spanish in the afternoons, appropriate to their age. But we were given the opportunity just to read and, in English, and there was no attempt made to teach us. And, we were in a very isolated bubble. I suppose like your granddad, he was in the services, was that right? You said earlier?
Yeah, he was in the Air Force, and he also worked for aerospace. And I think it was part of his job. He was out there. He eventually would live in Toulouse in France and worked on the Concorde project.
Right.
This is obviously a decade before that. And I think he was out there for work reasons. Yeah. But my dad went to a British school. I can't recall the name of it. It may be the same school you went to. What was the name of the school?
I'm trying to remember now. It did come to my mind the other night, but I didn't write it down. So I've actually just, for the moment, temporarily forgotten the name. Is it St. David's or St. James? Saint something, I think. But it was the oldest established English language based school in Buenos Aires.
I'm going to move away from your time in Buenos Aires in South America and kind of come back to the academia thing, because it's fascinating and particularly interesting with your dad's sort of academic background, because you went on to read English language at Oxford.
Yes.
And then go on to study a postgraduate degree in English literature at Bristol University. What do you think university taught you about life, yourself, and academia? And can you also talk about being tutored by Jonathan Wordsworth, who was the great, great, great nephew of William Wordsworth?
Well, trying to answer the last question first. Jonathan Wordsworth was a wonderful man to meet, and he had this very sort of casual, louche, identity that he was very casual in sharing with us pupils. I mean, if, for example, we each had to see him on our own once a week, and so the tutorial method was a very one-on-one thing. And you then had to read out your essay in that tutorial, and he'd just sort of listen and comment, make a few comments. And then once a week, we had the whole year in his college room. I mean, the year as in the number of pupils reading English at the college, which was Exeter College. And if, for example, you'd forgotten a book and it was the Metaphysical Poets, he'd say, "Oh, dear boy, I'll lend you my copy." And he'd get out a first edition of the book. And so you were sort of holding this like absolutely precious, precious object. And he had sherry in this big sort of store underneath his study window, which was all across the width of the building, kind of 15th, 16th century building. And so it was both intimidating, but kind of inspiring. And I would say the whole experience of Oxford was that. And it taught me a lot. It taught me about people, about, women, about friendship as well. But it also taught me that we're a part of a separate society in a way. The middle class, am I middle class? Is it fair to say that? Not really, because I didn't have a particularly identifiable background to claim. But anyway, the son of Keith Joseph, the minister, Tory minister, lived on the ground floor of the university room, which I had, on the same staircase. And the son of Haile Selassie from Ethiopia also lived there. And they were just from a different world, really. I mean, just an upper class, again, using these sort of generic phrases, which I'm not really comfortable to do, because I'm not sure that I believe in the working class and the upper class, or the lower class and the upper class. But anyway, they were from a different class. And there was a boy, for example, reading English in the same year at college. And as we were getting to know one another, he said, yes, I'm Julian Target. I went to Westminster School and I'm here because I'm focused on banking in the future, merchant banking, I think. And so he was kind of clear in his life ambitions, and that I hated. But so it was an opportunity for education. It was a very good education that I had. And so it was an English language and literature degree that I studied for at Oxford, and then a Master of Literature postgraduate degree. I came here to Bristol to study. And the business of the exams that we had to take was a pretty horrible experience, because everything led up to these exams at the end of the third year, which were just so pressured. It was ridiculous. And people kind of tried to commit suicide in the hall outside the exam room, and just breaking down completely. And that's how it was. And I think part of that system was just to test you to the ultimate. And if you could pass, or get the approval, the degree that you'd come for, in a sense, it simply proved something about yourself and your self-confidence. So it's a fairly incoherent reply to all the questions that you asked, but I'm sorry.
No, it's a fascinating insight. And I kind of wanted to move on next and talk about Bristol, because you made Bristol your home. Obviously, you firstly went to Oxford and then Bristol University. When returning to Bristol, you eventually followed a path in music, and you were a drummer in several bands. Can you describe the musical scene at that time, or when was that particular time, and what music inspired you to want to perform?
Well, I mean, I think the impulse to perform was simply there. Any chance to perform was a good chance. And I quickly, in 1978, this was early 1978, or the winter of 77 to 78, obviously I read the music papers with great interest, and the early punk thing was suddenly burst upon us with the Damned, the Clash, and I think even then the Sex Pistols had arrived and gone, if not very soon after. And I just was fascinated by the idea, and so went along very nervously to this punk gig at a pub down in Hot Wells, and just sort of loved it, because for all of the prickly exterior, on the inside of the experience, it was a very kind of family environment almost. Not really an exaggeration to say that. And it was very warm, it was very non-judgmental. Well, it was judgmental if you looked wrong, if you didn't wear kind of drain-pipe trousers, for example. But, basically, there was a warmth and a friendship there. And so I just got into a punk band as soon as I could, who were called The Media. And then with their lead guitarist, or rhythm guitarist rather, Johnny Britton, we formed several kind of parallel bands, one of which was the Tesco Chain Store Massacre, which I thought was a good title.
Oh, it's a tremendous name, play on words, yeah.
Absolutely. And so that played, Eddie Cochran and just rock and roll classics. But he got taken off by Bernie Rhodes, the manager of The Clash, and invited to go to London. And so he went to London, and we sat round as a band and thought to ourselves, oh, he's never coming back now. And he actually did come back after the tour with the Subway Sect, a group that he still plays with actually, and still under the guidance of Bernie though. But so he was back in Bristol, and his band had just gone. You know, we'd just decided to move on, and things happened so quickly in those days. And so we had this later band called the Spicks. And so all those experiences really just got my mojo up, as it were, my energy for and I love performing. I mean, that's the thing.
We've briefly touched on your fascination for the Beatles at a young age, who, you know, were kind of the ultimate band of the 1960s of the British invasion. And you've touched upon the punk scene in Britain and the bands you were involved in on that scene. I kind of want to shift forward a little bit in time to a new decade, and it's 1980 now, and you and a group of friends established a record magazine in Bristol, of course, called the Bristol Recorder. Can you describe the magazine and its content? And then can you also tell us why you approached Peter Gabriel to be featured in the magazine?
Right. Well, the magazine with the record was a really good concept. For one thing, it was packaged in a gatefold sleeve, and within that sleeve there was a sort of 24 page, very word heavy series of articles. And it was a very post-punk thing, you know, that unstoppable attitude of, we'd like to do this, we can do this, you know, no problem. And so the lack of money didn't stop us, the hurdles, we didn't see any hurdles, we only saw the opportunity to get something made, really. And the first record was made with purely Bristol bands, a band called the Electric Guitars, who were quite popular, a very good band actually, Joe Public, who again were very good, and a band Circus, I think, and a group of various artists. And so there were 4 local bands on the first record. And so the contents of the magazine were just of sort of issues of conscience, shall we say. There was a big serious article about suicide. There was an interview with the local MP, Tony Benn, who was a very generous man, gave us hours of his time.
Fascinating man as well, wasn't he? As a
Yes,
political figure. Yeah, incredible man.
And what else? Yeah, just as a gossip column. It was a very ironic magazine. And so the gossip was about local bands and local labels and stuff like that. And the reaction to those little comments, like, you know, rumor has it that, and would be the only sort of thing in the magazine that actually prompted letters from our readership. And so the thing of the Peter Gabriel interview was because we just thought, well, with you know, the local emphasis, we'll also try to interview locally based but internationally known figures. And so the first magazine had an interview with Peter Hamill, who had been in Van de Graaff Generator, who's an extremely nice man, and again, a very interesting interviewee. And then with Peter Gabriel, well, we were recording in Bath for the second album, recording more local groups for the record. Peter came into the studio at that time, and so I think I nervously approached him and just said, "Oh, hello, Mr. Gabriel. You know, I know who you are, and would you be willing to give us an interview?" And he very kindly said yes, he would. And so we went to his house soon after, myself and a pal from Oxford University days, Stephen Pritchard, and we spent the afternoon at his house. And again, he was very generous with his time and gave us an interview. And so there was also this background of a little sort of thing, little idea that was accompanying the interview, which was that it would be good for sales if we could have a little, you know, a bit of Peter's music on the record. And so we asked him, and he said, "Yeah, I don't see why not, but you'll have to clear it with my manager," which was an artist's way of saying yes on the one hand, but no, it's going nowhere on the other. Because Peter Gabriel's manager was a very tough lady, but who turned into an absolute ally, a lady called Gail Colson. So we rang her up to ask for permission, and the person delegated to ring her was another partner in the enterprise, a guy called Jonathan Arthur, and Jonathan could talk anybody into anything. And so,
good skill to have.
yeah, absolutely. And he came off the telephone call with a kind of, she said yes, she said, see, a lady from Charisma, Hit and Run. And so the condition was that we'd only print 10,000 copies, which, like, looking back all this time, seems like a vast amount, but at the time it would just be, whatever. And so we quickly did that and sold them all, and we were very happy with that success. And then in preparing the third volume, which had an interview with Robert Fripp, which was a remarkable experience in itself, and the Thompson twins, we were just casting our net a little bit further, and there was great ambition. I mean, that's the thing. It was ambition that really drove the project, but it was a good thing, I think. But then in the midway and after the third edition that was released, which would have been 1981, we got overtaken by the advent of the WOMAD idea and the activity of a festival.
I want to obviously come on to the concept of WOMAD and most importantly, how it all happened. But I think it's fair to say that Peter Gabriel was a huge figurehead around that time in British music. He'd been the front man, of course, with Genesis, Phil Collins, and then gone on to a very established and successful solo career as a musician. But what was your first impressions of Peter, and what had come out of that initial meeting?
The interview that I was describing, or the initial interview, the initial meeting about the festival.
Yeah, kind of the initial meetings with regard to WOMAD. How did that kind of all happen? And were you all kind of on the kind of same page at that time?
Well, yes, absolutely, we were. And we were very much the amateurs invited into a group that discussed the idea in the first place. And talking with other people involved at the time, especially a guy called Mark Kiddell, who Peter had already been sort of planning with, as it were, we realized, or I realized in writing the book, that Mark and Peter had got us identified as, they'll be likely lads, they can get things done, they can spare more time to this idea. And so the idea that we discussed at first was simply the idea of a rock concert that would be also a concert taking the opportunity to introduce a group from another place or another country. It wasn't called WOMAD at that point. It wasn't in any way located at that point in terms of a venue. And it didn't have a date either. So we ended up I remember the winter of 81, a winter of hope, but, no prospects whatsoever, really. And so, again, it was very ambitious and just, without any experience at all, any background experience on our part as the putative organisers. And so being on the same page or not, I've still got a letter that was like the first letter that we wrote to a whole host of individuals who we thought might be interested in our project. And it was signed by myself, by Peter, and by Mark Kiddell. And I remember the process of drafting it and getting it agreed. And so then it got sent out to Robert Fripp for one thing. I'm sorry, this will be a bit that you have to edit as I try to scan my memory.
No, not a problem at all. It's always the kind of worst moment, being put on the spot sometimes, thinking of names. Yeah. I'll tell you what, I'll move on slightly, and obviously we'll keep on the WOMAD topic, but I wanted to ask you what the challenges were involved in programming and organising the festival from its inception and onwards, and how did the festival evolve over time?
Right.
And do you have any memorable moments you'd like to share?
Oh God. Well, I mean, the second and the third question are, very complex to answer. In the first place, the festival in 1982 was a complete learning curve. We had to find a venue, and we found the Royal Bath and West Showground as the ideal place. And then we had to abide by the very clear rules that they set about how the festival could happen. And so, for one thing, they said that it was all very well having a big festival on that site, but there'd have to be limits, there'd have to be areas of control, as it were, because just to explain, in 1971, I think it was, there was this enormous event there, the Bath and West Showground, which was headlined by Led Zeppelin and Frank Zappa and all of the bands of the day, Pink Floyd, which I actually went to, and it was just this enormous semi-organized event, as things were in those days. And so there was this very strong farming community lobbying against another event, musical event happening there. But we had all these credentials to offer on our. We again convinced the committee, which was led by a man called Colonel Myers, I think, and he became a very strong ally, as it were, in our endeavors. But so we had to organize the layout of the site, what would occur at what time, and then make this distinction between the daytime outdoor activities and the nighttime concerts. And so the concerts were, in a sense, the easiest thing. On the Friday, we had Simple Minds, and Peter Gabriel played, and we had a dance company from China, the Tianjin Dance Company. Saturday was The Beat, the Drummers of Burundi, and Echo and the Bunnymen. And the Sunday was a very hastily late promoted affair with it was supposed to be a salsa party, and we found a salsa band from Holland called Salsa de Hoy, who sort of headlined it. And also, I was only told this kind of very recently, because we were just researching for a 40th anniversary of the WOMAD Festival, which Real World Records will be bringing out a record for in July, folks. And so that featured Place de la Concorde, which was a forerunner, or I'm not exactly sure whether it was a forerunner or a co-runner of Teardrop Explodes, the Julian Cope, wonderful Julian Cope band. And Peter Gabriel played a second set together with Shankar and Stuart Copeland on drums. And then the Salsa de Hoy. But the Sunday event was kind of a flop, really. And the process of organizing was just very difficult and very nerve-wracking, because all of the organization to get groups over from other countries, it was pre-fax, pre-internet, pre-everything that we now rely upon. And God, difficult it was, because every exchange of agreement, of contract, etc., had to be sent by letter, and then any other contact would be occasionally by telephone. And so communicating with Burundi in Africa, for example, Nigeria in Africa again, obviously, and Indonesia in Java was just extraordinarily difficult. But I must say, we're talking about this event as though I was just the only person. The key to a festival of any sort is cooperation. And so I would say I was the co-director and the co-this and the co-that, I was always accompanied by the efforts and the talents of other people. And I should like to say that really very clearly. But yes, it was a huge undertaking. And by the end of the process, at the end of the period of selling, suddenly there was a rail strike on that weekend, and so people couldn't arrive by rail. And the publicity had been, imaginative, shall we say, but with a triumph of style over information, shall we say. So it was the principles that Peter taught us, really, that you must treat artists with equal respect, was very much taken to a degree, as it were. And so there was no billing with any headlining names at that point. They were equally billed, all artists. And we didn't make it easy for ourselves, but the rail strike was a real, disaster for us. And so on the weekend, we simply didn't know how many people would attend. Because again, there was no way to get any information apart from ringing up the ticket agents in advance and asking what the late sales had been, and then counting numbers as they came in through the door. So the attendance actually wasn't bad, but in a sense dwarfed by the size of the site, which was huge. And the indoor concerts were sold out on the Friday and the Saturday, as you can imagine, and then sort of a scant attended on the Sunday because we'd promoted so late. And as the weekend went by, we were literally counting the cash, and we realized that it wasn't going to get home. It wasn't going to lick its face, as it were, wash its face, sorry. And we were facing bankruptcy, and the organisers and owners at the time of the Reading Festival, Harold and Barbara Pendleton, I remember being there at the time, along with Gail Colson, and them, trying to get us to face the reality. And Harold using the analogy of a plane journey and saying, well, you're halfway across the Atlantic and you haven't got enough fuel to get to the other side. And so you can either turn around now and sort of try to head back, or you can carry on to the end at least and, have completed the flight. Because through the weekend, various contractors like the stage builders were threatening to disassemble the outdoor stages. Catering had, fallen apart, etc. And so, but we, basically encouraged everybody to trust us, and went for it, went through the weekend, again, not knowing clearly what the situation was. I remember on the Monday morning after the event, there was a queue outside the bank of our creditors. And we'd been, golden account holders the week before, because we'd just received £50,000 from Warner Brothers for this compilation that we'd released called Music and Rhythm, that still stands today. I think it's a great compilation of music celebrating the festival. And there'd been talked over various tennis matches by a lawyer called Marty Machat, who was an associate, friend of Peter's, I think. And he was playing tennis with the head of Warner Brothers, who's, I think, Charles Levison. And, he finally either lost or won the necessary number of tennis games to say, so we've got a deal then, have we, Charles? And yes, okay, what do you want? And so, yes.
I'm going to skip forward very much in time and kind of ask you a little bit of a kind of generic question regarding the festival. And my question is, how did you manage to grow the WOMAD Festival and form an affiliated charity, the WOMAD Foundation?
Right.
And secondary to that, can you tell us about some of your favorite artists who played the festival?
Yes.
And also founding the Real World Records label in 1987?
Yes. Well, the charity, to answer that question first, we'd realized during the organizing towards 1982 that if you didn't have a charitable status, then you were actually ineligible for any grant income. And so again, a very sort of tough lesson to learn all too late. And so because we weren't charity based as a non-profit organization, that was a joke in the first place, because obviously there were no profits. Sounds like Shakespeare in Love, doesn't it? But anyway, and so in 1983, we were given the opportunity to organize a whole series of concerts at the ICA in London, the Institute of Contemporary Arts, as part of the Capital Radio's season of events, which was, I don't know what it was called, a summer nights or something like that. And so it was a marvelous programming opportunity. And it was brought to us by a friend and colleague who's sadly no longer with us, Alan James. Hi, Alan, wherever you may be. And so he said, there is this opening at the ICA, and would you like to work with me on programming and organizing? And so we had a budget, which is the key thing. We had a budget to keep to. And so in the aftermath, the ruins, as it were, of 1982, that was this huge thing of discipline. And so that accounts for the growth in one extent, because, you know, we realized there would not be a limitless supply of money. There was a budget that we had to stick to. And so we organized, I think, a very good program of artists. It included Rip Rip and Panic. It included Kanda Bongo Man from the Zaire. It introduced 4 Aboriginal artists from Northeast Arnhem Land, who genuinely just, you know, spent as much time getting across from Northeast Arnhem Land in Australia itself to an international airport, and then fly all the way over. They'd never been out of Australia before. And so it was a great, great event, I think. And so that was 1983 that we, in a very hot summer, that we programmed that event. And we'd made enough money from that to selling T-shirts during the intervals and on each night that just gained about £300-400 in profit, that we were able to go to a solicitor and get the solicitor to apply for the foundation of a charity, which was called the WOMAD Foundation. And so the charity came into existence from 1983 onwards. And in 1984, we then organised a festival in England, in Bristol, in fact, at a place called Ashton Court. Oh, you'll know Ashton Court.
Yeah, just literally down the road, yeah, ironically. Yeah.
And which was a very kind of, again, tough situation and a lot of negotiation, because we were tasked with organising or being in charge of both days. And then the WOMAD element would happen to an extent on one stage on those days. I think that's how it worked. And so there was a kind of resistance on the part of the committee that already existed. Then our input, as it were, towards the WOMAD experience on the other. And again, I think very good artists that we'd found by then. Total Mompesina from Colombia. Hugh Masekela played, I seem to remember, for £50, because they were already touring and, you know, basically needed the money, the gig, so that another day would pass with at least some income. And so it went on. And I think the key that was to what we learned over those early years in terms of the development of the organization was, as I mentioned earlier, first the thing of budgeting, and then in terms of location, learning to adapt and to be used to the festival happening in a different environment. And so 1983 led to 1984, from London to Bristol. And then in 1980, the late 84, towards an event in 1985, we'd been approached by Essex County Council to work with them to present the WOMAD Festival, which was already with a bit of a quiet reputation for whatever it was. And so they had a very creative chap at the Essex end, a man called Eric Hopwood, I think. And he, again, was a key ally. And so we organised an event in 1985 on an island in Essex, Mersey Island. And that was the beginnings of the festival being put back on its feet, really. We had a great lineup in that time, which I think people will still, you know, recognise various names from. New Order played, James played, The Fall. There was this huge contingent from Manchester, and there was also the Penguin Cafe Orchestra. There were Toots of the Maytals, Thomas Mapfumo and the Black Salmon Limited from Zimbabwe. it was a really, really great lineup, that. And that was attended again by kind of enough people, but I think it made about £34 in profit at the end of the day. And so in 1985, we really just looked at ourselves and tried to decide whether or not to continue. And continue that we did, and then we were entirely on our own looking for another site. We found a place just close to Clevedon on a farm called Kenmore, and we put a bill together there, which was again really good, but in some way also compromised by the headliners, because the only headliners that we could find for the Saturday night were Susie and the Banshees, and who were a nightmare basically. And yeah, but at the same time, preceding them on the stage was Houston Adore. So it was a mixed thing of many extremes, as it were. And back to the thing of 1982, I remember, for all our naivety, we turned down the willingness of the Stranglers to play the festival. We were, very kind of up on one, as it were. And they had a pretty bad reputation, to be honest. And their manager had rung up and said, do you want to sell some tickets or don't you want to sell some tickets? And yes, we do, but we don't think that you're a good reason to do so. And so we said no to the Stranglers. And so I was moaning about the lack of ticket sales, which I'm sure would have been very much boosted by that band being added to the festival in the first place. And back to 1986, and Susie and the Banshees, they were literally the only kind of group of any significance that we could find that were willing to play the event. And so it went on and then grew year by year. And the key thing again about how the thing of development occurred was that from 87 onwards, we organised more than one event in a particular summer. And so in that summer, we were in Cornwall for the main festival, which was wonderful. And we were also invited back by Capital Radio to do some shows on the South Bank. And we were invited to do a stage at the Glastonbury Festival. And so I think there was another 3 or 4 we had in that summer. And then making more of a mark with other festivals as much as with the public. The year after that, in 1988, we began to receive opportunities to work in other countries. And that was the thing that really changed the whole game from then on. And so we worked in that year in Canada, in Toronto, at a place called the Harbourfront Arts Centre, which had already got a whole season of outdoor summer events that was marvellous. And we went to the Roskilde Festival in Denmark and organised a section of that. And again, the main event, as it were, in England at the Carlisle Bay in Cornwall. And so, I mean, again, the original aspirations of the thing, which kind of knew no bounds, actually hadn't really rubbed off very clearly on the individuals organising us, as it were, organising 5 years later, because it was still this outlandish ambition, really, which knew no limits. And so in 1988, we had those invitations, and 1989 was suddenly just brimming full. Virtually every weekend of the summer was involving a different location, Finland, Sweden, France, etc. And through the 1990s, it gradually settled down, I'm proud to say. And we established events in Spain, in a place called Cáceres, which still happens every year. I think it's happening this year. And in Singapore, again, which happened for 10 years up until 97. I think that's how the chronology went. But anyway, after 10 years, we'd been investing in the prospect of better things ahead. And it had been very successful in terms of everything that the festival planned to be. It was a really mixed crowd. It was a very multiracial audience and some wonderful artists, some wonderful experiences, and with good sponsorship, but it just didn't generate enough money. And so we took the decision to cancel that particular event. But then we'd been invited to work in Australia, in Adelaide, as part of the Adelaide Festival of the Arts, and we first did that. I can't remember, but exactly when. There's so many experiences to tell. And that was a wonderful opportunity, a wonderful site, wonderful collaborators, co-organisers, as it were. And then that led to an event in partnership with our Australian colleagues to work in New Zealand, which is again an event which has been very much cancelled or affected by the COVID experience over the last 2 years, but is, I think, planned to make a return next summer or next spring our time, and so so the event continues, and as far as I know, it thrives. And in terms of the artists that I've been lucky and who I really remember working with, I mean, there is far too many to mention, but just to start off with relationships, in a sense, one of my most passionately supported groups and affectionate, vivid memories is a man called Remy Ongala and his Orchestra Supermatamila from Tanzania. Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan from Pakistan was a huge privilege to work with. I mean, it's the equivalent of working with Frank Sinatra or something. I mean, truly famous. Well, as was Remy Ongala in Tanzania, Dar es Salaam, and Youssou N'Dour, massive presence at every event that he ever played at. I mean, I could just go on and on, but
yeah, I can imagine. I wanted to again kind of skip forward in time, and you've gone through almost a plotted history of the festival, almost kind of year by year, and all this dedication, the passion has shone through so far. But I kind of wanted to ask you, after all that commitment, that dedication, the travel, the highs, the lows, the stresses, the fall-ins, outs, I can imagine at times, what made you decide to eventually leave the role with the WOMAD Festival in 2008? And did you have any regrets about making the decision? And since leaving the post, do you keep in contact with Peter and any of your other colleagues?
Well, that's a complicated question. The decision to leave was very much taken, as it were, on my behalf by the people managing Peter's career, who by that point were a controlling interest in WOMAD, the people at Real World. And they were keen to move me in my position, but move me, as it were, sideways. And I just didn't see that as a realistic opportunity. And so I decided, in the event of their offer, as it were, to withdraw. And do I regret it? Well, not since, because I was very happy subsequently, and I have been very happy since. I'm happy today. But at the same time, the schedule of work was absolutely intense. The travel was overwhelming. I mean, visiting Australia and New Zealand at least twice every year, and every country that the festival was taking place in, it was a role of great stress and a great, work. Gosh, it was a lifelong. It was a commitment, as it were. Every day, full-on commitment.
I imagine you have to sacrifice a great deal as well, and almost you don't have a life because your loved ones, your wife, your children.
Yeah.
I guess in some ways you have to, I don't mean it rudely, but you have to kind of put that aside in some ways because you're away all the time, you're traveling.
Yes. Well,
yeah.
traveling, yes, and away for weeks, days, weeks at a time, but then always returning, having, you know, time off, and then, sorry. And so the two things in my life were the festival and the family and the children. I've got 3 sons who are now kind of grown and turning out really well, I think. But I mean, I missed them so much while I was away. But they were absolutely my focus when returning to the country. And so I'd spend, you know, all these days away being catered to, living in hotel environments, and then I'd return to the washing up, the hoovering at home, the, you know, ask your mum sort of role of a father. And that's how it was, really.
I kind of, in a minute, want to kind of move on to your next venture, but kind of my other question was, do you still keep in contact with anyone that you work with, including Peter, of course?
Well, the answer is no, because I think that, well, I mean, a little bit from Real World Records, but I did feel very injured for a number of years after the event happened. That, you know, my invitation to go sideways, and then my decision to leave entirely. And I felt, you know, pretty unhappy in my memory about that. And so in a sense, like a love affair ending, you know, you just feel a thing of the heart at the time and bruised everywhere inside. But I mean, that gradually passed. But a trait of mine, I think, as an individual, is that once a relationship has ended, I don't go back. I don't look back. I'm not a member of the old person's society at the school, for example, or a member of anything to do with the university. I did keep in contact with a number of friends from my university days, and Alan James, who I mentioned earlier. But apart from that, you know, I didn't want to return to contact with Peter Gabriel, because I knew that he is extremely busy all of the time, and he would always sort of suspect people of wanting things. He would, I think, see any approach of mine to be with an agenda of wanting something, and I didn't really want that. I absolutely wouldn't entertain that idea. And so the answer basically is no.
We move on, and I want to talk briefly about your next venture, which is completely different to running a music festival. I want to talk and move forward to the millennium, to the year 2000.
Yes.
You ventured into the world of pub ownership when you purchased Bristol's historic Palace Hotel in Old Market.
Yes.
Can you tell us about the refurbishment project and what were the challenges involved, and how long did the project take?
Well, it was literally like 9 months of top to bottom refurbishment. I moved into a very decrepit premises, which had been run into the ground, I mean, in a way, by the previous owner. And for example, on the first day of taking over possession and ownership, if you like, we had to deal and get rid of 7 tons of rubbish that were absolute rubbish in the house. And from that point onwards, it was, you know, a top to bottom refurbishment, as I say, both respecting the downstairs premises that had a preservation order on them, on the interior of the environment, which was kind of quite ironic, because it sort of stuck in time the state of the pub on the ground floor, but on the inside, but that had already been changed from how the pub originally was, which was on the ground floor and the cellars. But anyway, that's a long story. But it was a wonderful, wonderful experience to look after and tend. It was like having a bird with a broken wing or something, and, you know, looking after the thing and seeing it take flight again. And so we reopened it, I think, in October of 2001, I think it was, 2000. And we were trying to make it a very, a firmly identified environment, both a local presence that built upon the past and also a place for music. Guess what? With weekly live gigs. We had a live performance every Thursday, and then DJ Derek played every Saturday as a residence. And so that was really fun. Although at the same time, what we learned was that there really wasn't a combining of the regulars and their wish to just sort of chat. And sorry, I say that in a fairly disparaging way. And I remember people being extremely offended by being told to be quiet during musical performances, and so barring themselves from ever setting foot in the pub again. And so they sort of worked in terms of the music often, but not in terms of the local relations very well. Mm. And then Saturdays with DJ Derek were great. I mean, he was a man who really knew what music to play. And he would always sort of say as he worked the decks, it's not necessarily the mood and the mixing and everything, but it's what order to play the songs in. It's the key to what he did. And so, yes, he was marvelous.
Shortly, I want to talk about another significant event in your life. But before I want to do that, I want to ask you one final question in relation to being a pub landlord and a businessman. Why did you eventually decide to give up that particular venture? How did that sort of end that tenure?
Well, after 6-7 years, I'm not quite sure which, it was a role, it was a place to live, which was just an everyday, there was no let up from it. When they talk about a public house, there are a lot of regulars who had actually, come every day. For example, regular as clockwork, there's a guy who turned up at 12 on the dot.
On the second.
Yeah, and he'd bang on the door, and if you were even a minute late, he'd spend the first hour of his time there complaining. And so there were a lot of people who kind of were seriously, unemployed and, sort of, in fact, their only employment was the full-time pursuit of their benefits, really.
And the vices of alcohol and tobacco.
Yes, absolutely. And so it also felt kind of morally compromised, basically, to realize that you were serving alcohol to people who were basically alcoholics. And it was good that they were out at a pub, in that pub environment, doing their drinking. But again, there were people who would literally spend 10, 11 hours in the pub every day. And so there was that as well. And then the place got not afflicted, it had its maintenance problems. The roof leaked. And in one particular day in August, there was a huge, flash flood in Bristol. You know how we sometimes get them when it just rain buckets for about an hour or two. And then afterwards, there are, great lakes of water everywhere. And that was the case with us on the corner of Old Market Street and West Street and Lawford Street, where the gutters simply filled up at the corner of the crossroads where the Palace Hotel is. And we just had a river of water running through the premises. And we just decided, myself and my wife at that point, Mandy, who was in charge of managing the place, we just decided, no, we've had enough, really, and just locked it at that point. And said, normal service will resume. And then we set about trying to sell the place. So it was a combination.
So I wanted to ask you two final questions before we come to the end of the interview, where we ask every guest the same 13 quick-fire questions,
right,
to kind of just wrap the interview and find out things maybe we didn't know about you, basically, Thomas. Firstly, I wanted to ask about a hugely significant event in your life, and I'd imagine tremendous joy and achievement when you received the CBE in the Queen's Birthday Honours List the year you left WOMAD in 2008 for services to music and charity. Can you recall the day itself, and how did you and your family feel when you received that news?
Well, firstly, I've got very clear memories of the day, and I think we all received the news with a mixture of disbelief and great, delight. And at first you think, no, there's got to be a mistake being made here somehow. And I had to make several phone calls to accept that it was true, they were offering it. And then after about a day of reflection, because I was very comfortable with the idea of being honoured by the award system, at the same time kind of troubled by the British Empire part of the award. And CBE is commander of the British Empire, which is kind of quite a high up award in the context of the OBE and the MBE. It's and so on the day itself, it was an amazing day. It was fantastic. Everybody was treated very nicely, very warmly, and I was extremely proud to receive my medal from the Queen, and who's tiny, and even then just standing for hours. And I just remember thinking, crikey, if this isn't work, what is it, because she was just on her feet for about 2 hours as all these recipients of different awards came forward. And there were these guards who at first I thought were kind of living statues, or statues somehow, in kind of full military regalia as we went up the stairs towards the waiting rooms. And then this colonel, or whatever he was, came in to instruct us about how to behave. The people being knighted, we were told how to advance and how to bow and how to step back. And we, as the CBE winners or appointments, whatever you call it, were told again how to behave, that we would address the Queen, we shouldn't turn our back on her, and when the interviews had come to an end, she'd extend her hand for a handshake, and then she'd sort of gently push you away, and so that was your signal to bugger off. And it was a really happy experience. As we sort of went there, we got lost in Windsor, and it was the second ever investiture at Windsor Castle, and so that was a hoot to see that place, the venue, as it were. And my three sons were very proud, I think, and kind of quite impressed by the environment. And none of us could kind of believe how vulnerable and how personal the Queen was, because she simply walked at the end of the ceremony through the aisle with the people attending past them. And it was actually a wonderful experience. I mean, she was a humble person, but there's a sense of her being both Her Majesty, but also kind of quite ordinary as well, a working majesty. And so, yes, it was a great day.
My final question, Thomas, before we move on to these quickfire questions, and a timely question to kind of ask, because music has played such an integral part of your life and your career choices, which we've established so much today. Can you put into words what music means to you, and what have you discovered musically and culturally from showcasing music from so many different countries and cultures?
Well, I mean, again, that's a complex question, but I think that music is absolutely the highest form of expression, and it's a kind of God-given, or it's a spiritual experience, I think, for the artist and for the listener, and it's the communication between them that will elevate both the artist and the listener to a exalted state. I mean, it's a difficult concept to express only quickly, and there must sound kind of quite pretentious to try to express, but I do truly believe that that's the case. There's something of mystery, of beauty, well, I could accept Slipknot, from that category.
You may offend a few people. Brilliant.
Yes.
Tremendous.
Yes. I think we're ready to move on to our quick questions.
Yeah. So we ask Thomas, every single guest, the same 13 questions. You don't have to think about these in any detail. What comes into your mind? I always find this fascinating. I hope you do too. Here we go. What is your favorite pastime, number one?
Listening to music and reading and communicating.
Interestingly, we've spoken so much about music, but not cinema. And I know you're a film buff, but what is your favorite film and why?
Well, I think I love The Godfather and I love Gladiator. I love mainstream titles, really, to be honest. I'm a film buff. I'm an absolutely keen movie watcher, but at the same time, I'm keen on mainstream art, mainstream cinema. But I absolutely adore movies. But I think of all the films I could watch and watch and watch, every scene in The Godfather Part 1 and Part 2 I love. And so I think that would be my answer.
It's a very strong choice. I'm a big Coppola fan, particularly that time period in the 70s decade. And Godfather and Godfather Part 2 would be on my all-time favorite list. Tremendous films.
Great.
Yeah, they're great. The acting is just sublime.
Yes.
Who would you say, you said about books, novelist, you like to read, but who is your favorite novelist?
Well, I'd say Charles Dickens is my all-time favorite. I'd also mention Lawrence Sterne, who wrote The Life and Times of Tristram Shandy. And Jane Austen I love. So from previous centuries, they're those. And in terms of this century, or no, the last century actually, but the 20th century, I loved Kingsley Amis. I think he's a genius writer. I like some of what his son Martin Amis has written. And yes, so those people I'd say.
You've done many different things in your life: festival organizer, businessman, entrepreneur, you could say. We haven't even mentioned the book. You've done that, a writing project as well. But if you could have chosen a different profession, what would it have been?
Interior lighting, I think.
All right, okay.
I love
design.
Yes, exactly. Just sort of seeing an indoor space and arranging the lighting in that space. I think I've loved that, I think. Or writing. But writing is very hard work and it's very solitary too. And I think I'd worry about running out of ideas, running out of good plots, or being compared to the people I admire and found lacking. So I think that's an inhibition that it's a shame that I have, and I recognize that I do have it.
Thomas, who would you say in life has been your greatest inspiration?
Well, I would say that Jonathan Wordsworth, who we talked about earlier, was, because he was actually the person who got me into the idea of promoting rock and roll, or more particularly punk rock, because he rang me up after I left university and he said, "Oh, Thomas, dear boy, how are you getting on?" And he said, "Would I consider organizing an event at the Royal Albert Hall featuring some of my punk friends as a fundraising event for the Dove Cottage Foundation or Trust, the Dove Cottage Trust that maintained the very famous cottage in the Lake District, which was known as the place where Wordsworth actually lived." And so he was busy on a kind of fundraising campaign for Dove Cottage, and he just sort of planted that seed. And I don't really think I had any ambition at that point towards music organizing. But from that point, I think I did. And it was a very potent thing, because I'm sure that in my heart of hearts, it was the inspiration that led to WOMAD, or being willing to be that organizing person. I remember, for example, going up to or approaching Susie and the Banshees, or Susie Sue, after a gig where my band had supported them at the Barton Hill Youth Centre, and I said, oh, would you be interested to blah 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 blah, and she just looked around and said, talk to my manager, and that was it. But anyway, so Jonathan Wordsworth, I'd say.
From Wordsworth now to newspapers. Do you read a newspaper? And
Yes, I do.
So, which one?
Well, I subscribe to two newspapers online. I read The Guardian for general information, and I subscribe to The Telegraph because I do their cryptic crossword every day, and that is a crossword that I can actually solve. So that's the two contrasting political sets of opinion I get. And apart from that, really, I look to the BBC for most of my media coverage.
Know something a little bit different. What would you say is your favorite food?
Sushi. I haven't eaten meat since 1975.
Oh, wow.
But I do eat fish, and so salmon or sushi, and vegetables.
A man very much who's traveled the world and met many interesting people, some of which you've touched upon today. But who is your favorite cultural icon?
Oh gosh, well, Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan, I think, or Ghulam Farid Sabri, who was another Qawwali singer, who were truly, truly famous in Pakistani and Islamic society. And their humor, their gentleness, their wisdom, if you like, were iconic and very important. I've learned so much from those guys. So yes, I'd say the Chief Sabri brother, especially, who was one of the first artists who I ever saw in this quest for artists for the WOMAD Festival. And yes, he was a marvelous, fantastic man, just with a twinkling wit and the ability to say things or not say things and know the difference, kind of thing.
Next one, what would you say is your favorite curse word and why?
Well, I don't want to say the word. Oh, well, but it's the see you next Tuesday word.
I love the way you'd skip around that. That was brilliant. Fantastic. What would you say is your favorite place or holiday destination?
Fiji, because there's such a different world in the south, in the southern hemisphere, and in the South Pacific, which Fiji is basically in the middle of. It takes you so long to get there, and you just travel if you fly there from Los Angeles, for example, it's something like 10 hours over the Pacific Ocean before you actually arrive. The size of the Pacific is just unbelievable. And then once there, the people aren't just sort of simple islanders. They're a very, very proud nation. And I enjoyed my time there very, very much.
A man with many musical tastes, liking music from various cultures, different styles, genres. But if you had to pick one, who is your favorite music artist and what's your favorite album?
Well, the Beatles, without a doubt.
I knew you were going to say that.
And my favorite record by them, well, it's a tough one, I think, but Revolver, Sgt. Pepper's, and then Abbey Road are all great, great records. And I think the prolific nature of their output. And also, have you watched the Disney movie Get Back?
I've seen some of it, not the whole thing in its entirety.
Well, I mean, that's a fantastic, I think, insight into how the group was. And if my love for the group could possibly deepen, it deepened with watching that movie. And also the genesis of Get Back, from the first time that you hear Paul just sort of, you're doing a sort of not a throwaway, but I mean, just sort of approximation of the riff, the basis of the song, and then working it up into the finished item, which they played live, of course, on the
rooftop. Yeah, that famous rooftop gig. Yeah,
is a fantastic thing. But so the Beatles, without a doubt, I think.
They were pretty special. I think they made impressions in many people's lives. They certainly made a big impression when I was in the early 20s.
Yeah.
What would you say is your greatest achievement to date?
Oh, well, I don't really see much of an achievement, to be honest. But I think that the principles of what WOMAD stood for, of promoting many, many artists and also respecting people, I'm very proud of doing. So yes, I think organizing live events with a true respect for the audiences is an outlook. And I feel that, so that I think was an achievement. But beyond that, I don't know. I mean, it's like listening to music, knowing in my own mind what's good music and what's bad music. I mean, what can you say? I mean, that's not much of an achievement, is it?
Now we come down to the ultimate question. Thomas Brooman, how do you wish to be remembered?
Oh, well, loving and gentle.
Thomas, I wanted to thank you very much for taking part in today's interview. I kind of feel quite fortunate in the last 12 months to have interviewed lots and lots of musical people, mainly musicians, and I think it's fair to say every interview I've done with those musicians or people related in music, their passion for music has shone through and come across. That's ultimately what they've always wanted to do.
Yes.
I think today, for me, it's been a huge musical education. I found it quite fascinating because I feel like I've been educated musically, but we've touched on so many other areas, such as, cultural differences, your time in South America. We talked a little bit about the class system here in the UK, about education and academia. And we could have literally been talking for hours, I think it's fair to say.
For sure, yes.
But it's been so interesting and just an incredible storyteller and an incredible mind of information. I just feel like very, very pleased to have just sat back and listened. So I thank you kindly.
Oh, you're welcome. I want to ask you, how many interviews for the website, the platform do you do?
I think we're up to 68 now, but only 50 so far uploaded.
Right.
But it's been quite a bit so far. So yeah. And lastly,
does each episode take a long time in terms of editing or sequence?
Not too bad, to be honest. The research takes probably a couple of hours, 2 hours, maybe a bit more. And the interview's normally about an hour, but some of them tend to go on a little bit longer.
Yeah.
So yeah, but thanks for taking part. And my final question, how do we get the book and find out more about you and also listen to you on air?
Well, you listen to us on air by just saying, Alexa, play BCFM. If you've got a smart speaker.
Come on now.
Yeah, it's in the other room. And that's about the only way that I use to do it. But if the website is BCFM, I think, and it's a really good website. We've just had it refreshed. And so it's got, the means of access there, the different ways of, is that right?
No.
No, it's not. Mine's just going to
It's
answer.
www.bcfmradio.com.
Yeah, the website is www.bcfmradio.com.